All right, so welcome to another Dep Dive with us today. This time, we're going to be looking at how language shapes our understanding of complex issues. Immigration in particular. We're diving into an excerpt from an article by Larken Rose, and he offers like a really sharp critique of the word illegals and the implications that come with that word.
Oh,
I'm really curious to see what you think as we kind of go through this.
yeah.
Do you think seemingly simple words can actually have the power to like manipulate people? I guess that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting area to explore for sure.
For sure, for sure.
And Rose argues that, when we use terms like illegals to describe people, that it reduces their entire identity to just their legal status.
Right.
And that's really problematic.
It's like, yeah, it's like we're stripping away their humanity,
Right.
reducing them to just a label instead of seeing them as, individuals with hopes and dreams,
Yeah,
all that.
exactly.
Yeah.
And, we've seen throughout history how that kind of labeling and dehumanization has been used to justify all sorts of mistreatment. And it creates this dangerous us versus them mentality, it can be really harmful.
Yeah. It makes you, yeah, it's a bit unsettling to think about, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm starting to question all my word choices. But
Right.
Rose also brings up this paradox that really struck me. He talks about how many people who are like really big advocates for individual liberty
Mhm.
also support strict immigration controls. Like, how do those two ideas even coexist?
Right.
Yeah.
It does seem contradictory on the surface.
Yeah.
But Rose suggests that fear plays a big role. When people feel threatened, even if that threat is perceived rather than, an actual real threat,
Mm.
they're much more willing to compromise on their values.
So it's like a trade-off. They're prioritizing security, even if it means sacrificing some degree of freedom.
Potentially.
Yeah. Okay. But then Rose goes on to challenge this whole idea that undocumented immigrants are simply trespassers, like they're breaking into a house. He points out that the U.S. government doesn't actually own all the land within its borders, which that made me stop and think, is crossing a border truly the same as like breaking into someone's private property?
Right.
Like, is it really?
Yeah, and that's the question that Rose really wants us to grapple with.
Okay.
He argues that simply stepping onto land that isn't privately owned isn't automatically a violation of property rights.
Okay.
It's a much more nuanced issue than the trespasser analogy would suggest.
So if it's not really trespassing, why is that narrative so pervasive? Like, who benefits from framing immigration in those terms?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads us to Rose's argument about how, you know, those in power often manipulate public perception,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to immigration.
Okay.
He contends that the ruling class oftentimes uses fear and division to control the population.
So instead of focusing our anger on policies that might actually be harmful, we're being distracted and pointed towards immigrants as like the scapegoat.
Yeah, it's a possibility he puts forth.
Yeah.
It's easier to blame, outsiders for problems than to confront the, complexities of the systems that create those problems in the first place.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, look, a magician is trying to distract us with this bright, shiny object over here, but over here, the real trick is happening.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Rose brings up a common argument that's used against people who support immigrants' rights. The whole, if you care so much, why don't you take them into your house line?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever heard that one?
Oh, absolutely. It's a
Yeah.
classic.
Yeah.
Just shut down the conversation. Don't actually engage in meaningful debate.
Right.
Rose dismantles this logic pretty effectively. He points out that opposing violence against somebody doesn't mean you're obligated to personally shelter them.
Yeah. It seems like such a flawed comparison. It's like saying, well, if you're against animal cruelty, you should adopt every stray cat and dog.
Exactly.
It just doesn't add up.
And Rose argues that that type of rhetoric relies much more on emotional manipulation than sound reasoning.
Right.
It's designed to trigger a gut reaction rather than encourage critical thinking.
Makes you wonder how often we just fall for these emotionally charged arguments without actually like stopping to think, wait a minute, does this even make sense?
Yeah.
Rose doesn't just leave us with a critique of these arguments, though. He also issues a warning.
Okay.
He says that by, accepting state violence against any group, even if we don't personally agree with it, it can set a dangerous precedent.
Okay.
That's a pretty serious claim. What are the implications of something like that?
Well, Rose connects this idea to broader historical patterns.
Yeah.
He's essentially saying, hey, this isn't just some abstract theory. We've seen this happen over and over again throughout history. You know, think about it. When we allow the government to use force against one group today,
Right.
what's to stop them from using it against a different group tomorrow?
So by turning a blind eye to what's happening to others,
Yeah.
we could be making ourselves more vulnerable in the long run.
Yeah,
It
potentially.
feels like we're strengthening the very systems that could one day be used against us.
That's the essence of Rose's warning.
Yeah.
He's urging us to recognize those, authoritarian tendencies, no matter who they're targeting,
Mm-hmm.
and to actively resist them.
Resisting something as big and complex as, systemic oppression
Right.
can feel overwhelming. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is just becoming more aware of how language is being used
Yeah.
to manipulate us.
Okay.
Start paying attention to the words and phrases that are used to dehumanize and demonize certain groups,
Mm.
and challenge those narratives,
Yeah.
and be mindful of your own language choices.
So instead of passively accepting these labels and generalizations, we need to actively, push back against them. It goes beyond just words, though, doesn't it?
You're right. It's also about holding those in power accountable for policies that violate individual liberty.
Right.
Speak out against injustice. Don't just be a passive bystander.
Rose also emphasizes that morality shouldn't be defined by what the government deems legal or illegal.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder that we have to think for ourselves, develop our own internal moral compass. But if we're not just following the rules, how do we determine what's right and wrong?
That's where critical thinking comes in. Rose argues that each of us has a responsibility to carefully examine situations, weigh the evidence, consider the potential consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
It's about, engaging in some thoughtful reflection and not just blindly accepting what we're told.
So it's not enough to just passively disagree with something.
Right.
We have an obligation to actually do something about it.
That's the question Rose is posing. He's challenging us to consider what our responsibility is, to challenge unjust laws and policies, even if they don't directly impact us.
Okay.
It's a call to action, to move beyond just complacency
Okay.
and become active participants in shaping a more just world.
So this whole deep dive has really been an exercise in critical thinking.
Yeah.
I've realized I take a lot of things for granted. What about you? What's resonated most with you from Rose's work?
I think what stands out to me is the reminder that we can't afford to be complacent.
Right.
We can't simply turn a blind eye to injustice, even if it doesn't directly affect us. Because once we start accepting the idea that it's okay to violate the rights of some, we open the door to the violation of everyone's rights.
It's a stark reminder that we're all interconnected.
Right.
And that the fight for justice and equality is a collective one.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step on this journey of critical engagement?
I think it's important to acknowledge that this is an ongoing process.
Hey.
There's no finish line when it comes to challenging oppressive systems and thinking critically about the world around us.
Right. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
We got to be patient with ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
We're all at different stages in this journey.
Exactly. And the important thing is that we keep moving forward, keep questioning, keep learning.
Yeah.
We need to keep the conversation going, even when it's uncomfortable,
Right.
even when it challenges our deeply held beliefs.
So how can our listeners start putting these ideas into practice? What's one tangible step they can take today?
I think a good place to start is to choose one word or phrase that you've been using uncritically, maybe without even realizing its potential harm.
Okay. Yeah.
For example, think about the words we use to talk about immigration.
Okay.
Are there terms that carry underlying biases or reinforce negative stereotypes?
Like the word illegals, for instance.
Exactly. Once you've identified that word, do a little research. Learn about its history, its impact, the power dynamics it reinforces, and then make a conscious effort to use a more accurate and respectful alternative.
It sounds like a small change,
Yeah,
but it could have a ripple effect.
absolutely. If we all start being more mindful of our language, we can shift the conversation in a more positive direction.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And those small changes can add up to something much bigger. They can help us create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected.
It's interesting how Rose's exploration of language and oppression, it kind of extends beyond just the issue of immigration.
Right.
It makes you think about the bigger systems of power at play in the world and how they really shape how we see things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Rose's point about the dangers of just blindly accepting state violence,
Right.
it's a powerful one.
Yeah.
He's saying, if we just accept the idea that anyone who breaks a government rule deserves to be punished, you know, without thinking about the context, the morality of the situation,
Yeah.
the human.
We might find ourselves on the receiving end of that same logic one day.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize how important it is to always remember the humanity of those who are being targeted, regardless of their legal status, their beliefs, or their background.
Because ultimately, as Rose emphasizes, we're all in this together.
Right.
What affects one of us affects all of us.
Mm-hmm.
We can't afford to be complacent or turn a blind eye to injustice, even if it doesn't directly impact us personally.
Right, exactly. And by accepting the idea that it's okay to violate the rights of some, we open the door to the violation of everyone's rights.
It's true.
It erodes the very foundation of a just and equitable society.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
What's the takeaway message, the call to action for our listeners?
I think Rose would say that the first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need to recognize the ways in which language is being used to manipulate and divide us. We need to question the narratives that dehumanize and demonize certain groups.
And we need to start examining our own language and the assumptions that we might be unknowingly perpetuating.
Awareness is crucial,
Yeah.
but it's not enough, is it?
You're right. Awareness is just the spark.
Right.
It's the fuel that ignites action.
Okay.
And that action can take many forms.
Like what?
Well, for example, we can start by choosing more mindful and accurate language. We can engage in difficult conversations with friends and family who might hold different views. We can support organizations that are fighting for justice and equality. We can contact our elected officials to voice our concerns about policies that violate individual liberty.
Right.
We can educate ourselves and others about the history and impact of oppression.
Yeah.
There are countless ways to make a difference,
Yeah.
big and small. And they all start with that initial spark of awareness.
So, to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought. Don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Speak up, challenge the status quo, and never stop fighting for a more just and equitable world.
Because as Rose reminds us, the language of oppression thrives in silence. Let's make some noise.
That's a wrap on this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey of critical thinking. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.